Hello, and welcome to the Imposter Syndrome Network podcast, where everyone belongs, especially if you think you don't. Welcome, imposters. My name is Chris Grundman, and I'm here with the hostess with the mostest, Zoe Rose.
Heyo.
This is the Tom Nadeau episode, and I think you're going to love it. Tom is an engineer and an engineering leader. He's an architect and an industry visionary who's worked across both startup and large company environments, and both equipment vendors and service providers, as well as within standards bodies and other things around all of these things. He's often focused on the details of developing successful products. Hi, Tom. Would you mind introducing yourself a bit further to the Imposter Syndrome Network?
Hey, thanks for having me on. Appreciate having me on. I love talking to folks about these different topics. Yeah, just a little more on the intro, what I'm doing these days. I'm a CTO at Spirent. If you folks haven't heard about Spirent, we do testing of everything. Software, hardware, primarily in network, in the network space, although we do RF and things like that. But working on some really cool stuff these days. Literally rocket science is one, which is pretty cool. I didn't expect to be working on satellite technology when I joined here. Just some other just really wicked cool stuff. And like on a personal front, just Memorial Day weekend, taking it easy, recovering a little bit.
Yeah, nice. Myself as well. And you're right. We're going to dive into some of that stuff. We're definitely going to get right into many of your achievements today. Probably not all of them. We don't have time. We'll run out. But I do want to start kind of at the very beginning. I know you started at Cisco, I think, in like 1998.
Even before that, it's not even on my sheet. Yeah, it was actually a place called Xyplex with an X.
Okay.
Xyplex. And this was in 1992, 1993. And Xyplex actually was, this is even before that time when you mentioned Cisco. Cisco was still not long after startup land at this point. And there were other companies around like Zylogic, Shiva Networks. This was the beginning of Nortel days, way back when. And we were pretty much, competing with all of those sort of the bigger router companies at the time. This was before actually real switches were around. I mean, we're still making bridging routers and things like that. It was a weird time, but yeah, you got to start somewhere. And it was really a fantastic place to start. I guess for your listeners, one of the things, the way I got the gig was worth talking about. I had gone through a bunch of different gymnastics in undergraduate, and for better or worse, I guess the more things changed, the more they remain the same and all that. I actually spent my first 2 years of undergraduate doing AI at the time, if you can believe it. We're building autonomous underwater robots, primarily for cleaning ships and things like that, but never worked right. Lisp was a thing. Lisp was not the thing the IETF people think of Lisp today and all that. But it was a really good experience in that the way I impressed the folks at Xyplex was actually seeking things out myself. I had kind of rebooted my thinking of what I wanted to do, and my AI thing didn't work out, and I was really into networking. And I thought, wow, I want to get into this. I had never really actually played with real routers and switches. I'd done coursework and all that, and somehow found some Usenix mailing lists, topic lists about networking, and bumped into this guy, Bob Stewart, who some of you may still remember. He's one of the original people that invented the Simple Network Management Protocol, SNMP. And Bob and I got to talking. It turned out Bob lived about 40 minutes from me in New Hampshire and had a really interesting story, a really non-traditional story. Like he went to college for a year, it didn't work out, ended up got a job at DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, and somehow fell into this thing. And he told me early on, one of the things that really caught his eye about me was that I just really was enthusiastic about trying. Obviously I didn't have the skills, but I was curious and I was trying, really those two things. And I still remember, it was still to this day one of the hardest interviews I've ever had in my life. It went over 2 days. People think, oh, the Google thing's hard or whatever. Like I was writing code. I was actually having to write firmware code on hardware I'd never run on. I mean, talk about like having your head explode as a first interview, going, "Oh my God, I'm never going to make it through this." And that's actually one thing I still use today, by the way, is that they told me later they didn't really care what answer I got. They just wanted to see me do it and see me think through it. And I still use this technique today when I interview teams. Because, one of the things you'll learn in engineering over time is that there's usually more than one solution. And if you get too caught up on my solution, you're never going to maybe get to the right solution, the best solution. But it was these experiences that really like lined me up early on to just to do it. Like Bob Stewart told me, he was trying to get me to go to the IETF actually early on in 1992, 93. And I said, geez, I don't know if I can make it. I mean, there's all of these juggernauts that are at this thing, and all these, a lot of these folks now I still refer to as friends of mine. It turned out, it was another sort of lesson or experience for your listeners in that you don't know what you don't know. Go and get in there and try, do it. And Bob told me, he said, one of the secrets to being successful at the ITF are the people that roll their sleeves up and do the work. He says, a lot of people are going to want to talk about things. They're going to want to tell you to do things. He said, that's fine. He said, but the most successful people are the ones that sit down and just write it down, build it, get it going. And it was not long after that, he introduced me to Keith McClurry as well, Keith McClurry, depending on how you pronounce his name, back to pronunciations. And that was sort of that. And then not too long after that, getting into starting at Cisco and going there. And then that really opened my eyes to like what possibilities were. But, just reflecting on my first experience, it was very frightening in the sense that you don't know what you don't know. And reflecting on that now, I very much kind of understand that now, the 4 stages of human learning, like unconscious incompetence. That's where I was at. I had no idea. I walked into a lab and I was like, what are those things? Are those routers? Wow. And I had similar experiences later when I was teaching later on. I'm still an adjunct professor, and I enjoy teaching, but I still remember the look on students' faces when I used to teach classes at Cisco in Chelmsford in Massachusetts, graduate school classes for networking. And at sort of halftime, we'd have a 2-hour course. At halftime, I'd take students for a tour of the lab. I'd say, let's go upstairs and walk through. Like we had a whole floor that was stuff, and it was really like, I have to admit, it was really kind of cool watching their reaction because it was the same as mine from when I, first started. They were like, oh my God, is this what the real stuff looks like? But anyway, that was a fun experience. And just sort of reflecting on the first experience, it was really like those 2 things. Get in there, roll your sleeves up, and just be voracious about learning. Learn, and do. And since then, I'll tell you too, some of my best teammates on my teams over the years, including currently, but even previously when I was at Red Hat, I had a really large team. And before that at Brocade, I had a really large team there too. The best folks there are the most curious and the most tenacious. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of background into what I was thinking way back when.
Well, like full disclosure, when I started, my very first network diagram that I drew in school was it included unicorns and magic.
Yes.
So and
It
happy
still does
readers
today,
had smiley faces. Yeah. Well, I got to a point where I just didn't know where to go anymore. I got certain things put together and I got a decent way through, and then I'm like, and now there's magic.
And now there's magic, right? There's physics or something, right? Yeah.
Something. Well, looking at your career, it's been quite lengthy. It's about the same age as me. So it's interesting to see kind of the start and then where you are now. I think it'd be interesting to see, what do you currently do? Like, what is a day-to-day kind of look for you? And on that, being as you mentioned earlier, your current business does testing of hardware and software and basically testing all the things. It's interesting to see, why do you think you ended up there?
It's interesting if you go back to the first company I was talking about. I had this conversation or debate in my mind at the time. I remember this because I'd been at the first place for a couple of years, and a few of the folks from the network management team had left, and I got to know them. Very nice, very wicked smart engineer. Also, last name Nadeau. No, fun coincidence, and I still know Maria. But they convinced me to split and go over there, and it was a dual startup experience, which was also interesting. But it was also doing something a little bit different. And this was the first time in my career that I really had to take a risk, like step out of the box. So to give you an idea, I was building embedded router switching software at the time. This was doing application network management, which was different, and it was a new thing and got me out of the box that I was in. And it was a little scary, but back to the first two principles: learn and be curious, be tenacious. And I figured things out, worked my way through it, gained an appreciation for a completely separate avenue of networking that I might not have gotten into. And then it was really interesting because in the network management group, I ended up being the bridge between the embedded software teams and the network management teams. And I did things like I wrote parts of the CLI on the new device. And it was this weird, like, I won't get into the details, but it was this weird hybrid technology of, semi-generated code even at the time. Ooh, from models, i.e. MIBs. And it was a good experience that, which is where I am today, very much how I got here today, including this position that I'm in today. Sometimes you need to, it's like that scene in Indiana Jones, the third one, where they're in the quest at the end for the cup, and the very end with the bridge where they have to throw, they eventually throw the sand over the bridge and realize there's really a bridge there. But it's the leap of faith part where you have to take the step off of the diving board into the unknown. Not that it's that dramatic or anything, but it really is an analogy for what's going on, right? It's not a life or death thing or anything, but it could be a career ending thing depending on how you do it, right? And that's very much how I've done things in my career the whole time. A really smart person that a few of you may have heard of gave me this advice a while back too. Dave Ward said, think about not just the next gig, the one after that, the next gig, the penultimate gig, because it's not that you're ready to leave, but the second you join a new company or something, it's that you've given your trajectory some thought. And it's not that you necessarily are going to do that exact thing, the penultimate thing, but what it does is it gives you a direction and a plan, and it makes you think about what your plan is, what your trajectory is. This is one of the things that I don't think a lot of people do enough of. I interview students all the time. I have interns in my team right now, and I've had interns for quite a while. And interns are fantastic for all the right reasons. But what they do is they give you an interesting perspective on what's going on today in academics and all that. And I got to tell you, like maybe the last 10 years, there are a lot of students that I interview for roles, not just as interns, but as, new hires. And there's not a whole lot of that going on, not a whole lot of thought about what they want to do. I ask people, why are you here? What do you want to do here? And I sometimes get this blank stare, like, what are you talking about? I want a job. And that's really like where you can trip and stumble, is by just, I'll do this, and that's how the midlife crisis happens. People do that, and then they look up finally 20 years later and go, oh shit, I didn't want to do this. But now I'm boxed into a corner and I can't figure it out. That's a thing. Like I knew of a friend of the family that years and years ago that also was an example of that for me, that I saw just go way too far down one path, and then realized, got down there, and that at that time, I was in my early 20s when I saw this, and this gentleman was in the 50s, and going, wow, I'm out of runway, I think, and I can't learn anything new and all that stuff. I consciously thought about that the whole time. in terms of the penultimate thing and the trajectory and where do I want to be. Now, I don't necessarily think that, 20 years ago I said I want to be a CTO someday. That's definitely not how that works out. And, as you'll discover, like I discovered, this job is not necessarily what the persona of the job is. And a lot of my roles previously were the same way. Part of it gets back to, be curious and tenacious and figure it out. Sometimes I was given a role that was, it could have been written on the back of a napkin. That's the amount of detail that you were given. That can be really frightening and overwhelming, if you let that be what it can be, right? And really, like I found for myself when in those situations, and then ultimately, like the one I was just talking about, around thinking about the penultimate, the job after the current job, it all just revolves back around sort of just being conscious about what you're doing. What do you want to do and why do you want to do it?
Yeah, that point you made about planning for your next role. I mean, I would say that there have been situations where I did not plan and it worked out, thankfully, but it was simply I needed a job. I needed the money. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yep.
But I do agree, I definitely do agree with the planning ahead and seeing, okay, where do I want to go? Because you have most companies have budget for training. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, yeah, okay, you need to, the training is there for you to maintain your skills in your role and whatever, directly relatable. But also, if there's somewhere you want to go to, like maybe you work in infrastructure and you want to go into cloud security or something, you can start taking training at your business, maybe moving internally, maybe, or maybe preparing for the next role, because certifications are bloody expensive. So
Yeah.
take advantage of what you can.
Right. Yeah. And you may be able to get it, for nothing, or not just the training. You could do education after. I did my master's degree at night.
Yeah, fair.
I was fortunate enough to have my employers pay for my master's degree completely, 100%. That's something that I consciously had in my plan, by the way. I want to have a master's degree, not to get one. I wanted to have one so that I could teach at university, as bizarre as that sounds. But that's just that was my plan. Slugging away at 2 a.m. on some graduate school project, I kept telling myself, don't worry, this is the investment in the future. So I can teach. And it turned out pretty well. That's how that worked out. Other things don't always work out though. And you've got to, like you said, Zoe, you either get dropped in a situation of a very large unknown, or, and for whatever reason, and you have to make the best of it. I had a few of those in my career. After I was at British Telecom, the first .bomb thing happened. And I caught a lot of heat for where I went to work after that, for a little while anyway. And it was like what you said. You do have to pay the mortgage. I have 2 kids. You do have to be an adult also. So there's nothing wrong with that either. But during that time, I kind of used that to think about really like, this is a stopgap. And where am I going to go for sure after this? It's like a training example. Use the resources that are at your disposal to the max and use that to craft your situation. And you don't necessarily have to work towards exiting the company that you're at, because sometimes you can reformulate your situation. I know a lot of people that did that when I was at Red Hat, moved around the company. And this depends on the company too. The company's culture has to allow it, has to facilitate it. As you know, internal transfers and positional changes aren't always, even though they're on the surface, they're okay. Under the hood, politically, maybe not.
And they typically have a cap on how much they'll increase your income, even if you're going to a more senior role. So sometimes it is financially a better decision to leave and maybe come back even, so it's good to not burn bridges.
Right.
But sometimes it financially makes more sense. I mean,
that's another thing too that you touched on, like don't burn bridges. That's a thing that, I've been in a lot of situations that were not only very frustrating, had some legal aspects to them sometimes too, and when you're faced with those things, you have to still operate, in a coherent and a cohesive way, and not let things go off the handle, so to speak. And that's another thing that I encourage people to do is things like that. They might feel good for 30 seconds and then you go, oh, geez, what have I done now? That's part of the plan. It's not to the extreme point where, you won't be able to find a job again ever or anything like that. But, be careful because you're right. You sometimes you may want to come back to a previous employer. Things like that will make it difficult. People often don't forget stuff like that. And I will tell you too that I have one very specific case where that happened, where I had kind of a nasty situation, and it was at my second gig, and you can chalk my behavior up to very much immaturity. But one thing you can do is in the future, I turned that around. I had an opportunity where I was actually forced to sit down with this one gentleman, and we buried the hatchet and sorted it out. And in fact, I used him as a job reference in the future.
Oh, wow. That's definitely a turnaround for sure.
And there was another one where, I was at Cisco early on, and again, in the immaturity and flailing around of the IETF at the time, inadvertently really insulted somebody, and really I just sort of ate my shoe after. I was like, oh my God, that was such a stupid thing to do. And I called her up and I apologized and I invited her out for lunch and bought her lunch. And we're still pals today. I talked to her a couple of months ago, about working together and all that. Redemption is a thing. Even if you do make a mistake, there are ways to back out of it. You just have to have some humility sometimes too. I guess that's another thing out of the past experience. I tell people to keep in mind, is sometimes things just don't work out the way you think they will. But you can work to repair the situation, get it back, hopefully. If you can.
At least making the effort, right? At least putting that effort into there.
Yeah.
So you've talked about the IETF a couple of times. I know you were co-chair of NetMod for a while. You were co-chair of the energy management. I think EMAN is the name. Yeah, EMAN group. You've also done a ton of stuff like in the Linux Foundation with the Technical Advisory Council and the LF Edge board and a bunch of stuff there. I think you're now currently, a committer for the Apache Software Foundation for the Area Tosca project. I mean, just a ton of like really deep industry involvement. And I know a lot of that obviously being kind of, in product development, product management through a lot of your roles as a distinguished engineer or otherwise, a lot of that's tied in. Is all of that just purely part of the job? Or, I mean, how did that co-evolve, right? I mean, has it been jobs sending you, or you're at the IETF and that leads to jobs, or how do those things all work together?
It's a good question, because sometimes it depends. Sometimes it's one way, sometimes it's the other way, which is to say, this goes way back to advice I got from Bob. He said, these things are means to an end. These aren't a career choice. When we've seen there are people that do that for a living, they do the standards thing for a living. And it was that advice. And then, my longtime mentor and very good friend, George Swallow, also told me, he said, never get too far away from engineering because you'll be irrelevant. You'll be working on the ivory tower stuff, and chances are low that will mean much. So, that's what I've always tried to do is the things like at the IETF, the things I worked on are things that not only I believed in it or was passionate about, but was implementing, to some degree. I guess the only exception would be E-Man. I did that as kind of a favor for the area director at the time.
Yeah, sometimes there's just work that needs to be done, right? And
yeah, that's what I was saying earlier too. Like sometimes work needs to be done. It's not the sexiest thing in the world or anything like that. And you make it what it is. I parlayed that into getting another chair position in NetMod, for example. You got to do it. Can you do the job? It was a good test. So keep that in mind too. Sometimes, well, actually a lot of the times you're not going to be handed the choice project as an engineer. You've got to prove yourself, can you do it and all that. But I've always looked at those things as a means to an end. The Linux Foundation stuff, the Apache stuff that I did, those were all done in the context of projects that I was working on, or in the context of, like Apache was a good example where I was I was consulting for a company at the time, and that was part of working for them. But I also used it as a growing opportunity for me. They were going to pay me to figure out how to run this project for them and be one of the committers. And then that was also another contrasting experience to the one I had at the Linux Foundation previously to that, where I worked in Open Daylight and some of the other projects. But, it's also good to understand things are done differently in different places. So later now, fast forward even further forward from those two experiences, I actually do this internally a lot of times. I have to decide, are we going to join a project or have a new project? Where am I going to put it? Where are we going to do it? Who are we going to collaborate with? A lot of that experience from the past is used for things like that. But again, there were things that I could see that were needed to be done. Like at the beginning, I mentioned when I was at Juniper way back when, Open Daylight was not even a thing. SDN controllers were a thing, but really commercially primarily. And there were some open source ones starting, and a bunch of us got together and could see this, this is happening. And let's figure out the right open source one to be the vehicle for this. What was interesting is most of us had no actual contributing experience in open source. Most of us take, install, use, that kind of thing. But it's very rare, relatively speaking, that people contribute back to any of these projects. So that was the scary part too. It was like, what are we doing? We don't know what we're doing. We'll figure it out. And we did. But it's a good example of, to your question, Chris, I worked on that project specifically because of that. And then ultimately went to Brocade and was able to build a team and a product out of that. I generally wouldn't have worked on that after if there wasn't a commercial thing in that, because otherwise it's a toy project. And you can see since then, my interactions with different organizations, like you mentioned, Linux Foundation and some of the others, OCP and things like that, my interaction with those is very tactical and very specific. So it's very complementary or directly associated to projects we're doing internally. Like the IETF work as well, that's another example where, generally speaking, if you rewind back to when I started over there, almost every contribution I made, every RFC from that time are MIBs that I had implemented. So I was implementing them or building them with other folks. And so, and that's why those are still used today. They're very specific to implementations and making implementations work. In fact, that's where the EMAN, I mentioned the EMAN part, we didn't implement that. I didn't implement that at all, but I actually did get involved in some of the implementations where I was working at the time, just simply because people couldn't understand. And there are only 12 little MIB variables for a UPS, but they're very useful if you know they're there and you know what you can do with them. So that's been my kind of experience. I didn't really want to make a career out of working at or for any of those kinds of organizations. Certainly temporarily and all that would be fine, like being a chair, like NetBod chair. I implemented an initial implementation of NetConf around that time. And so I had experience with the technology and could help drive it in the right direction. I worked on some Yang models. The SDN project at Open Daylight was going at the same time. So we were ingesting those models and incorporating them. So it was all being worked together. I rarely have anything that's just floating in the side as a pet project. That's just kind of some noodly fun thing. That's what I have guitar and a farm for.
I had a question about your quite fast career. I imagine there's been situations where you're like, that was a little bit of a mistake.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a situation you could think of that maybe it was a horrible mistake, but you actually learned a lot from it? Like maybe it was I don't know, something happened and you learned to go from there.
Oh, yeah. I probably shouldn't bring up names just so I don't
Fair.
annoy people or have lawyers calling me. Either way, no, but I definitely have, and like I mentioned that one situation, Zoe, where the dot bomb thing happened. There was nothing to do. In fact, right around then, my family was supposed to move to London. We were going to relocate. We were in the middle of this whole thing, and then that all got shut off. And so you have to do what you have to do. I've had a couple of spells between pretty significant assignments that I've had in the past. I've done consulting. You just to kind of you have to pay the bills, but consulting, it's funny because it keeps you in the mix, and eventually something falls out of the hat, and I've gone and done something else, something more significant. Because it's interesting. I know a bunch of people who have been in those situations, and rather than doing the consulting thing in between, they just don't work. They just take the time off, and all that. And I guess if you're doing something specific, and using your time wisely, I guess that makes sense. I know some people that just went sat on a beach for 6 months. I don't know. I mean, sounds great. Sounds like a good time, but not my thing. I mean, I've been on vacation for 5 days, and I installed an irrigation system. I worked on my tractor. I got a whole bunch. I got my guitars disassembled downstairs. I mean, I've got to be
My
doing
skin would not
things.
appreciate a week on a beach. That's all
Exactly.
I'm going to say.
Yeah, I get bored after 3 days. I'm like, I wonder what I can do here.
That sounds familiar. And speaking of having too many things to do and not enough time, as expected, we've pretty much run out of time here before even getting close to covering the fullness of your amazing career, Tom. We didn't even touch on the books you've written. Are there any other projects, stuff going on right now, maybe the podcast that you'd like the Imposter Network to know about?
Yeah. Check out the net.lol, the podcast. We focus on networking as a broad cardboard box to put things into. We talk about networking related issues, but the other day we were talking about generative AI and ML as it pertains to that. Some of us are working on this stuff, and it's sometimes we have interesting guests. We've actually had a couple of career episodes where we've had people come in and talk about stuff. And then I guess besides that, I don't know, other interesting things going on in the industry these days, obviously around 5G and containers, that whole space, server evolution. I'm working on all of those things. That's really interesting. Where's all that going? I don't have any books in the works for a while. I guess that was the last one, the duck book. There is a unicorn in there, Zoe, in chapter 1. But I don't think I'll be writing any of those for a little bit. I'm just too busy with, the new job. Being a CTO is not, I guess that's the other interesting thing that's, I'm working on. That's one of my big projects right now is, it really is a project in the sense that it's not, in a lot of ways, it's not what I would have expected it to be. Like growing up as an engineer, you expect that to be the pinnacle of engineering. You're just like the Midas of engineering of some sort. It's all just like 100% of the time, fascinating projects to work on and build it. Turns out that yes, that's true, but then you have a whole other job or two to do other things. And not that it's bad or disappointing or anything weird. It's just, it's not what you think it is. And I've learned a lot in areas that I never thought I would have been spending time on, like finance, the importance of running a business correctly. Go figure, working on a lot of other interesting topics around strategy, strategic partnerships, M&A type stuff, finance, personnel stuff. One of the things I do these days is I co-manage the intern program here. One of the things that I've learned from my mentors over the years, folks like Dave Meyer, George Swallow, I mentioned, Bob Stewart, these folks, is that it's important to give back to the engineering community. So being a distinguished engineer, means, various things. One of those includes being a good shepherd for new DEs and fellows and training them to be very, very good engineers. And that's a very deliberate and specific thing that I'm very passionate about, and I do here. And I have at a variety of previous gigs. It's really important to support that. And, like you were saying, when you bring earlier in the podcast, early, when you bring in junior engineers and folks, that's the path that you can put them on. They can be on, and that's part of the plan. Is this where you want to be? Okay, let's head towards that direction. And here's what you need to do to get there. So those are the things I'm up to these days anyway.
Awesome. Well, that's great, Tom. Thank you so much for sharing your story with the Imposter Syndrome Network. And thank you to all of our listeners for your attention and your support. I know that time and attention are today's most valuable resources for everybody. We appreciate you spending them here with us. We do have a LinkedIn group for the Imposter Syndrome Network that we'd love for you to join to get or give career advice, mentorship, or just general community support. Although, I do have one more question for you, Tom, if you're willing.
Yeah.
After, not to date you too much, but I'm just doing the math here. It's, maybe 40 years of engineering and technical career at this point. If there was a new, cloned Tom that was just starting out right now in 2023, but could talk to you, the Tom with this wisdom from, a decades-long career at this point, what advice would you give younger Tom starting out right now?
Have a plan and don't be too disappointed when you trip, because you'll get up and carry on. That's what I would tell myself. Don't let people disappoint you too much. Believe in yourself more.
Fantastic. We will be back next week. See, the problem is now that I started recording after all of the intro talk, we have nothing for the B-roll.
Oh, jeez.
You're such a terrible person.
Yeah, I just totally messed it up.
Who's in charge here? What's going on?
Yeah. We'll take something silly that I said in another episode and just tag it on the end of this one, and it'll all be fine.
Could do. We have lots of that content.